Hello. In this presentation, we're going to explore a few key concepts dealing with osmoregulation, which deals precisely with how animals go about regulating the osmolarity of their cells. Whenever we talk about osmolarity, we have to think about water concentration, and we have to think also about the concentration of solutes in the cells, the tissues, the fluids of an animal. And what we are going to see first is going to be the concept of osmosis. Now we have to think a little bit about concepts we studied in Bio 211. Osmosis, by definition, is going to be the movement of water molecules from regions of higher water concentration to regions of lower water concentration. This movement is going to be sometimes in an effort to achieve something we call equilibrium. However, dynamic equilibrium is not always achieved, and the cells and tissues of animals must be going through constant regulation. And that's why we're looking at this concept of osmotic regulation. In this illustration, we can see, for example, how water molecules, which are represented by blue dots, are going to be moving from a region of greater water concentration. On the left side of this illustration of this chamber, you can see that there is only water. There are no solutes. And on the other side, there's going to be solutes in combination with water. For that reason, we can say that the concentration of water on the right-hand side is lower. A good part of the volume here is occupied by solute molecules. Consequently, water will be moving from where you have a greater concentration of water molecules to where you have a lower concentration of water molecules. It is one of those specific forms of passive transport because cells don't have to invest energy to allow for this kind of movement. So when you think about osmosis, think about water for sure. But we also have to think about the concentration of solutes in the places where animals live. I will go back to the previous illustration. For example, in this case where you have solutes only on one side, we can also say that the concentration of solutes on the right side of this chamber is greater than the concentration of solutes on the left side where there are no solutes. Describing the concentration of solutes is what we do in terms of tonicity. Tonicity is the relative concentration of solutes in a solution. And so, for example, when you think about the environment in which animals live, the environment outside the body of the animal can be hypertonic. Hypertonic meaning that there's a higher solute concentration, and if they have a greater solute concentration, like in the previous picture, there's going to be also a lower water concentration. If you say the environment outside of an animal is hypotonic, it means that there's a lower solute but greater water concentration. So as you can see from these two definitions, whenever the concentration of solutes goes up, the concentration of water is going to go down. And keep in mind also when tonicity, when we talk about hypertonic, we're talking about the concentration of solutes. Isotonic means equal solute and water concentration. And an isotonic environment can be achieved sometimes when you have this dynamic equilibrium and the concentration of both water and solutes is the same on both the animal body and also the surrounding environment. The most ideal environment for animal cells is going to be an isotonic environment. And we can see this from an illustration we also explored a couple of quarters back when we covered osmosis in Bio 211. Look at, for example, what happens in an isotonic solution. If the concentration of water and solutes inside of the cell is the same as it is outside, dynamic equilibrium takes place, and for every water molecule coming into the cell, there will be one water molecule going out of the cell. This helps maintain the shape of the cell and also the functions, the reactions that are taking place in the cell. If, however, we put an animal cell like a red blood cell, which is a picture here on the left-hand side, the same red blood cell in a hypotonic solution, the outside is hypotonic, meaning that there is a greater water concentration, but hypo means lower solute concentration. Osmosis always moves water into the hypertonic side of a membrane. And so in this case, there are greater concentration of solutes in the cell because the cell has carbohydrates, proteins, amino acids, ions. If the outside is just water, then water will be moving into the cell. And if there is no form of regulation, the cell will gain so much volume until it's going to explode. Well, in reality, the term we use in biology is going to be lyse. Lyse means break. The cell will break as water moves in excess into the cell. The opposite would happen in a hypertonic solution. In a hypertonic solution, the concentration of solutes outside the cell is greater, meaning also that the concentration of water outside the cell will be lower. And that's where water wants to go, to the hypertonic side, where you have the lower water concentration. In this case, the red blood cell will be losing so much water until eventually it will shrivel to the point it will not be able to function and the cell will die. And so we are looking at the concept of osmosis now from an animal perspective, and we have to think about what can animals do when they live in specific environments. Think, for example, about many marine invertebrates. Marine invertebrates, in general, they have a limited ability to carry out regulation. And so many of them are going to be osmotic conformers. What they do is they try to maintain an equal solute concentration inside of their bodies as the concentration of solutes in the seawater. There can be some regulation, some water can be retained, but if the concentrations of solutes and water in the body of the animal are about the same as the outside, then there's no need for regulation. However, there can be two strategies. One is going to be the species that we can describe as stenohaline. The first part of this word, steno, means narrow. And stenohaline means that these are animals that can only tolerate a narrow range of salinity. Take a look, for example, at the spider crab. These spider crabs usually live deeper in the ocean, where there's not too much of a change in the concentration of the salinity. So if we look at this graph here, spider crabs can live in places where the molarity of the seawater can be 400 micromoles all the way to about 650 micromoles of water. So let's say, just rounding up, that there's going to be a 200 micromole range that a spider crab can survive. But remember what I just said. These animals live deep in the ocean where there's going to be very little in the concentration of salinity in the water, and so they don't have to worry about a dramatic change. In contrast, take a look at the shore crab. The shore crab lives at the edge of the ocean where land meets the ocean, and you can expect there to see a greater degree of environments. For example, when it rains at the edge of the ocean, near the beach, if it rains, the pools of water where these crabs live will receive all the fresh water from rainwater runoff, and those pools of water are going to see a decrease in the concentration of salt. The water will become more dilute, and that is going to be a change for these animals. If, however, we're dealing, the next day there's sunny conditions, there's a wind, and there's a low tide, the pools of water where the shore crabs live are going to experience evaporation, and with that there's going to be an increase in the concentration of salt. So the concentration of salt will increase. So you can expect to see this kind, now look at this graph, the concentration of salt in the water inside of those pools where the shore crabs live is going to be very diluted on a rainy day. It can be very concentrated on a hot, sunny day. And so what happens with these animals is that they can tolerate this wider range of salinity. It's going to be almost like a 300 micromoles change, as opposed to, I'm sorry, not 300, more like 600 micromoles in change, as opposed to only the 200 we saw before with the spider crab. So euryhaline means that they can tolerate a wider range of salinities. Now, what about an animal like a fish that lives in the ocean? Fish in the ocean can move in different places, and so they're going to be dealing with various changes of salinity. Regardless, as long as they are in the ocean, this animal, this fish, is going to be in a hypertonic environment with a greater concentration of solutes. And so what can you expect will happen to the animal? Take a look at this illustration. If the animal lives in a hypertonic environment, the salty seawater, they are going to be losing water by osmosis. Through the gills, through the skin of the animal, water will be lost. At the same time, they're going to have a problem in that salt will be moving into the body of the animal. There's going to be a gain of salt also whenever they eat. And consequently, the animal is going to deal with this hypoosmotic regulation, meaning it wants to maintain a hypotonic body in comparison to the hypertonic surrounding seawater. If it's losing water, what can the fish do? Look at the answer. Fish that live in the ocean are going to be drinking water. And the water they drink is going to help replenish the water they are losing. But that also represents a problem because these fish are now going to be getting more salt. So what can they do with the excess salt they are taking in? The solution can be seen here. These animals produce a urine that is very concentrated. It's a small amount of urine, so they don't lose additional water, and there's going to be a high concentration of salt ions, sodium chloride, that are going to be excreted through the urine. So producing a concentrated urine allows the fish to get rid of excess salt. And if you look at this part over here, there's going to be also excretion. Whenever we talk about excretion, it usually involves active transport, moving of salt using active transport from the blood out to the gill epithelium and then out to the surrounding water. And so these are the strategies that the animal is going to do. It's going to drink water. Well, they get the water, but they also get salt. And they don't want the salt. So how can they get rid of the salt? Well, produce a concentrated urine and getting rid of salt through active transport and through the epithelium of the gills. What about a fish that lives in the freshwater? Now, this fish has the opposite problem to the ones that are living in the ocean. This freshwater fish is going to be dealing with the problem that too much water is moving in. Water can be gained by osmosis through the surface of the fish. And at the same time, they're going to be losing precious salts and ions through the urine, through the excretions, and also they're going to have this need for regaining salts and regaining ions. So what do? These animals are going to be getting rid of a lot of water by producing a larger volume of urine, which is going to be pretty dilute. There's not going to be very much in terms of salt ions, sodium and chloride. That's going to be very small. So they will retain most of that. At the same time, they avoid drinking water. So they're already getting an extra water through the body covering, so they don't need to be drinking more water. There's going to be a little bit of water they gain whenever they eat something, but that is going to be eliminated through this diluted urine that they are producing. And so, as you can see, they have to perform something called hyperosmotic regulation. They want to maintain a hypertonic body as they live in a hypotonic environment. The strategies here are: don't drink too much water. You may say, hey, but I've seen those goldfish at the pet store, and those goldfish are always like gulping like large volumes of water. Well, they're not drinking the water. They're simply moving the water through the gills so they can get oxygen. But also moving water through the gills, they can end up taking up some additional salt ions by active transport from low concentration in the surrounding fresh water into higher concentration in the blood that circulates through the gills. Also, they produce a diluted urine. They produce a lot more urine than a seawater fish. But the urine they produce, even though it's larger in volume, is very diluted. There are not very many ions there. And they can get additional salt ions through active transport as they move blood through the gills. There are some animals that are not going to have the luxury of any form of water during parts of the year. For example, this animal you saw before in lab, you remember the cute little water bears? It's a tardigrade. They live in temporary pools that form during the rainy season in places where these animals live. But then the rain goes away and the pools dry up. And what these animals can do is that they can get rid of most of the water, not all, but most of the water, and encase themselves into what looks like a cyst. And so this dormant state that is basically saving the body of the animal in the minimum amount of water is known as anhydrobiosis. And hydrobiosis can also be seen in certain frogs and toads that live in the desert. During the limited amount of time that may be water from rain in the desert and pools form, they go out and reproduce. But before those pools completely dry out, they bury themselves in the mud. Then they secrete protein material that forms like a cocoon covering the body. They also get rid of excess water, and they can remain dormant until the next year when the rains return, when they break out of this cocoon, rehydrate, and then go on through the process of reproduction so that they can complete their life cycles. Pretty amazing that animals in the desert can do that. Maybe I'll have to find a video and share it with you guys and show you how frogs, amphibians, can follow the same strategy that these little microscopic tardigrades do. What about animals that live on land? For terrestrial animals, the problem is that they are living in an atmosphere where water concentration is going to be very low. So they're constantly going to be losing water by the process of evaporation. Evaporation can lead to water loss through the skin, our entire body surface, and also through breathing. The nasal epithelia must moisten the air we bring into the lungs, but when the air goes out, that humid air is going out, leaving our bodies, taking away precious water with it. You've seen this effect. When you bring your face too close to a glass, you can see how the glass fogs up. That is because of the humidity you're going to be losing. So how can we get back the water we're losing? Mostly by drinking for humans, and also from food we eat. Usually the food we eat has an abundance of free water. Like if you're eating a soup or a salad or fruits, you can imagine all the water that is present in those food items. And there's going to be a little bit of metabolic water. This table here shows for humans how much water, percentage-wise, we get from drinking, from the food we eat, and from metabolic water. And at this moment, you may be asking, what in the world is the teacher talking about when he makes reference to metabolic water? Metabolic water is water that results from cellular respiration. You may recall the equation for cell respiration we studied in Bio 211. 1 molecule of glucose in combination with 6 molecules of oxygen will produce 6 molecules of CO2 and 6 molecules of water. This water here, although it is a byproduct of cell respiration, it is actually not a waste. It stays in the cells and contributes to the supply of water cells need to perform other reactions. So this metabolic water for us is not as important, only 12%. But think about something like an animal that lives in the desert. The desert is dry. There's not much water available. How can these animals get water back from what they're losing? Look at how they're gaining water. Not from drinking. There are many animals in the desert that live the entire life cycle is completed without ever taking a single gulp of water. What about free water in the food? Not very much, because remember, the things they're finding in the desert are pretty dried out. They're pretty baked. There's hardly any water in the items they eat, like seeds are pretty dried up. Maybe they find a dead insect, it's also pretty dried up. But for these animals, metabolic water, this water we mentioned coming from cell respiration, makes up 90% of the water they need. That's pretty amazing. And if you ask me, what type of molecule can provide an animal, what type of food with the greatest amount of metabolic water? The answer, may not surprise you, is fats. Fats have a lot of hydrogen atoms that in combination with oxygen can form water during the metabolic breakdown of fats. So when these animals eat something fatty in the desert, they're also going to be securing the water that will follow when the metabolism has taken place. Losses for animals in the desert, urine, they don't urinate very much. Evaporation is a big problem for them. And feces is going to be a very minimal amount of water for them. And so that's what animals must do in terms of regulating, getting the water they need, compensating for water they may be losing or maybe getting rid of excess water, and also other minerals and ions that may contribute to the well-being.